polymorphism in Java. The polymorphism is when an object can take many different forms. Okay, so let's do an example of student. We have a student interface, and the student interface will have a method, which is, let's say, void study, right? So this is going to be a public abstract method by default in the student interface. And we will have another class that's called online student. So the online student will inherit the student interface and will inherit all the methods and the variables from this interface. So let's implement the abstract method from it. Now, when we say study for online student, we will say online student is studying from home, let's say, right? And the online student will have its own methods, like let's say public void join online session, right? So we will give an output saying online student joining the class via the Zoom, right? So student is joining through this Zoom. Now let's have another class that will be called in-person student, right? And in-person student will inherit the student interface, right? The student interface will have a static method, and we will implement this study abstract method saying in-person student studying from campus. We have a student interface, and we have two classes that is inheriting this student interface. The one is online student, and the other one is the in-person student. So this is going to be our student interface, and this is going to be online student, and this is in-person student. Now this class is inheriting it, and this class is inheriting that student interface. Now coming to polymorphism, right? So let's create the students class, right? And create a main method. And in the main method, we'll try to create an object. So we all know that we cannot create an object out of student. Why? Because student is an interface, and we cannot instantiate the interfaces, which we cannot create an object out of interfaces. But can we create an object out of online student? Yes, we can. We can make this online student, right? But what is the polymorphism? Polymorphism means when the subclass being created as an object and the reference can be a same class or the parent of that class, which is online student class. So the parent is a student interface, can be a reference for a online student. So the reference is a parent, and equals to the object is going to be a child class. We call this kind of objects as a polymorphic objects. So this is a polymorphic object, and polymorphic object will have a reference as a parent and the child as a object. Now, how this will work? What kind of methods and the variables will have an access through this object? So we will say student dot, and when we say dot, we see the method study. The study method is actually exists in student interface, right? But this method study was overridden in online student class. If you go to online student, this method was overridden. And when we call this method will be pointing to the method in student interface. If I will go to this method, I'll click on it, it will take me to the student interfaces method. But when I run this method will be running from the subclass, which is online student, which is overridden method. Right? We have online student is studying from home. That is being implemented from online student class. That's what we have given as an output here. But what about the method that online student has in it, right? If you go to online student, we have another method, which is join online session. Can we call this method from the student object? We say join online session. Looks like we can't call this method. The reason is because this method is not available in student interface. So that's a main reason. Here in a polymorphic objects, the reference part decides what variables and methods it can access, and it can access only the reference types, variables, and the methods. We can't access the variables and the methods from the object side type of class, right? But if you still want to have an access to the object type of classes, methods, and the variables, then we need to cast this object, which is student, to the online student type. So we gotta put this into the parentheses, saying, hey student, go down to online student class, which is your object type, and call me the join online session method. So when we run this, it will run this join online session methods. We have, right? So this is the output we had there. Now this is called a downcasting. Downcasting in Java. We take that object, which is student type of reference object, downcast it to our online student class, and call the variables and methods from there. All right, this is about the polymorphic objects. But in polymorphism, we have two types of the polymorphism. One is the runtime polymorphism, and other one is the static polymorphism. What is the runtime polymorphism? Which is, we call it dynamic polymorphism. Runtime, or we call it dynamic polymorphism. Runtime polymorphism, when we call the method, let's say student.study. So when we call the study method like we did here, right? So at compile time, this method will be pointing to the method that we have in the parent interface, which is student interface, right? But when we run this method at runtime, it will be calling the one that is overridden one from its online student class. And that's what we call a dynamic polymorphism. When a method looks to the parent class or interfaces method, and when we run that method, it runs the overridden method from the child class. And what is the static polymorphism? Static polymorphism can be achieved when we apply method overloading. Let's say we have a method of public static integer get sum, right? So we say integer num1, integer num2, right? And here we will return the sum of these two numbers, num1 plus num2. So now we have the same method name, but three parameters this time. We will say integer num3. And we will add these three numbers now. Here, when we call this method saying system.out.println get sum, and we will pass two numbers, let's say 3 and 6, right? So here we pass two parameters. When we call this method will be calling this method, right? And when we run it, it will be running exactly the same method that it was pointing at the compile time, which is adding these two numbers in this method, right? So at compile time, when we call this method, it will be pointing to this method. At the runtime, it will call the same method, which is this method. It doesn't change its direction when it is calling at the runtime. So this is called a static polymorphism. we can achieve static polymorphism with the method overloading, and we can achieve the dynamic polymorphism with the help of method overriding. We're overriding the study method. That's how we achieve dynamic polymorphism. And yes, that's all about the polymorphism in Java.